Hello everybody, Maven here, and 14 months ago I did a video testing out every exotic primary weapon in the game to figure out which one does the highest DPS. And I thought I would revisit that idea for today because ever since then there's been a lot of individual weapon overhauls and a lot of sandbox changes, so it is likely drastically different than it was before. So we'll be heading to the Templar for our DPS testing, and our only buff is going to be the Well of Radiance. There are no other external buffs. And just one last disclaimer, but we'll only be testing out 11 weapons in this video because here are the results from the last video we did 14 months ago, so we'll just be taking some of the top performers from those results, as well as a couple new weapons that didn't exist when I filmed that video, and individual weapons that got heavily impacted by their overhauls or sandbox changes that do have potential. So we won't be testing every single primary in the game because that would take forever. We're only testing the good ones that have the highest potential to have the highest DPS. So with that in mind, let's get to it. Don't forget to drop a like because it helps out a ton, and these types of videos take a lot of work, so I greatly appreciate it. And I hope you enjoy. So let's start off with the Vex Mythoclast. As you know, it got its RPM reduced, but it received a plethora of other damage buffs. So the Vex Mythoclast is going to start us off by setting the bar at 279,377. Now, I just barely realized as I was recording this voiceover that I accidentally had on the artifact mod that allows your solar weapons to scorch unscorched combatants. So we got like 2,000 extra free damage. It's not the biggest deal in the world. It can be like around 277,000, but still, Vex is doing a lot more than it was before after all the buffs it got. Now let's move on to the Devil's Ruin. So since the last video we did, sidearms received a 20% damage buff, and also in that last video we didn't use Well of Radiance, and this one we did, so I honestly expected a lot more out of the Devil's Ruin. Next up, the Tarrabah. So the Tarrabah was by far the top performer in the last video we did, and currently right now it's a top performer, but not for long, spoilers. And we even missed a few crits, but it's totally fine, it doesn't matter. And something else I learned about the Tarrabah that is completely irrelevant to the video is that when you place down your Well of Radiance, you're in a brief animation where the game thinks you stole your weapon, so you lose like half of your Tarrabah charge. So that's why I had to have a buddy place down a Well of Radiance for me, so it's kind of awkward. So while the Tarrabah does do a lot of damage, you kind of got to jump through hoops for it. Moving on to the Outbreak Perfected. So as you know, pulse rifles received a 12.5% damage buff this season, so I honestly expected a lot more out of the Outbreak Perfected, so I'm kind of disappointed. The Outbreak Perfected was once the king of primary DPS, but oh how the mighty have fallen. Next up, the Buzzard. Yes, your eyes are not deceiving you, the Buzzard. So we end up with a whopping 256,000, putting the Outbreak Perfected, the former king, to shame by a long shot. So like I just said a second ago, sidearms got a 20% damage buff since that last video, and also the Buzzard has kinetic tremors, which just received a massive buff specifically for sidearms. It used to take 12 shots to proc kinetic tremors, but now it takes 8. So the Buzzard, especially with overflow, is an absolute beast. I just had to try it out in this video because it is easily the highest DPS legendary primary in the game. If you do not have this role, you gotta farm it next time it comes around in the GMs. Next up, the Wish Ender. So why the Wish Ender? Well, in the last video I did, it was right around the time that Wish Ender got its huge buff, and I did not even try it in that video. So I felt like I had to give it its chance in this video. Plus, it just does a crazy amount of damage. It does as much damage as a sniper rifle. It is a very unfair primary. It's the best endgame primary in the game, so I just had to give it its chance. And it did not disappoint. It outclassed the Outbreak Perfected, so that's something. And I even guarantee I could have gotten at least a couple more shots off if I didn't charge the bow as long as I did. I probably could have squeezed out just a little bit more. Now moving on to the Hawkmoon. So just like sidearms, hand cannons also received a 20% damage buff since the last video I did. The Hawkmoon is actually a super solid and underused primary weapon in PvE. It's a lot of fun to use because those paracausal shots are not too tough to get. And as you can see, it does a respectable amount of DPS, breaking 300k, so it's pretty good. And next up is the Touch of Malice. And there's what you wanted to see. Of course, Touch of Malice is going to be at the top because it is actually built for DPS. That's what it's for. So ever since the last video, scout rifles have received a 10% damage buff in PvE, and also the Touch of Malice individually has received a 20% damage buff on that final round. So overall, 30% more damage, and it's hitting like a truck. But still, it's a very tough weapon to use because you really got to build into it. The self-damage, just in general play, is way too much to deal with. So you kind of got to suffer to get this crazy amount of DPS. That's its downside. And now we're moving on to the Tommy's Matchbook. So yes, I did go on to Titan to use Actium War Rig. Now, I know a lot of people in the comment section are going to find this a little bit unfair because in theory, we could use Malfeasance or Warden's Law along with the Lucky Pants, but Lucky Pants is an entirely different beast. It's a little bit unfair to test because it basically turns your hand cannons into heavy weapons. So it's a completely different entity. And that kind of thing is really meant for its own separate video. So anyways, back on topic of the Tommy's Matchbook. So since the last video, auto rifles have received, I believe, a 25% damage buff in PvE, and also the Tommy's Matchbook itself received a massive scorch buff, so it only takes a few shots to cause a solar ignition, and we got Ember of Ashes. So that is really putting its DPS up there, and it actually went over the Tarrabah's DPS, which I'm surprised about. So yes, the Tommy's Matchbook is hitting like a truck, but you kind of got to use it specifically on Titan with Actium War Rig, so it's very limited. Tarrabah you can use on literally anything. And now moving on to the sweet business. Alright, so originally I wasn't going to try Sweet Business in this video, but like I said, auto rifles received that 25% damage buff, and also Sweet Business received that new perk where every 10th shot is going to cause an explosion for a little bit of extra free DPS, so I thought I'd give it a try, and it actually performed a little bit better than I thought it would. It did better than the Outbreak Perfected, so that's something, but it's still crazy to me that the Buzzard does more than Sweet Business with Actium War Rig. Isn't that insane? And speaking of sidearms, let's try out the final warning. Yeah, not gonna lie, I kind of expected this DPS out of the final warning because this sidearm hits like an absolute semi-truck. I've tested it against Carl many times and it kills Carl in 2 magazines. It takes 3 rockets to kill Carl, and it takes 2 mags of final warning. It's a sidearm, it's primary ammo. The DPS of this thing is absolutely ridiculous. So this is a weapon that did not exist from the last time I made that video, and once again, sidearms received that 20% damage buff. So the thing you do with the final warning is you don't actually hold down the trigger for the entirety of the charge. You let it go like a second after holding down the trigger, and then you spam fire. You just click rapidly on your fire button and just try to spam at the crit, aiming down sights to get that enhanced precision damage, and you can just try to fire off the entire mag while you have that precision bonus. It's weird and it takes a lot of learning, but that's how you do it, and that's how you get a lot of DPS out of it. But you know, the downside is you have to be up close because it's a sidearm, but the thing hits like a truck. Also, the hip fire projectiles are amazing for ad clear, gives you free tangles. It's just an incredible and underrated weapon. I've used it in Grandmaster Nightfalls, and it's insane this season because of anti-barrier sidearm. So definitely give the final warning a try. So on to the wrap up and some honorable mentions. I thought I might try out the Thorn. The Thorn might have some potential because of the new overflow capabilities it received this season, along with the 20% hand cannon damage buff. So it might be worth testing, but it did so little damage before that I just didn't test it. But if I can go back in time, I probably would try it out. And another hand cannon worth mentioning is the Sturm, but the Sturm you really got to jump through hoops for. You got to run double primary, get like 20 drain kills before DPS, but you know, pair that with a 20% hand cannon damage buff, and that could probably blow everything else out of the water, but it's just way too much setup. And speaking of too much setup, there is also the Revision Zero that possibly might be worth testing because the 12.5% pulse rifle damage buff, and you have the sniper mode with 4 times the charm. When it turns into a sniper, I don't know if it still takes advantage of the 12.5% pulse buff or if it actually becomes a sniper. I really don't know. But that weapon takes way too much setup. It's not practical. It's too difficult to use. So I would say the main takeaways from this video is that Buzzard is insane, and Hawkmoon and Final Warning are some of the most underrated and underused exotic primary weapons. So anyways, that's going to do for this one. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, be sure to hit the like button and let me know down below in the comments if I may have missed any high DPS primary weapons. And of course, if you are new here, please consider subscribing. Would love to have you here. And with that, I will catch you in the next video. See you later.